Witam Państwa bardzo serdecznie na drugiej sesji naszej konferencji.
Session of our conference.
Jest mi niezmiernie miło, że mogę
It's a true pleasure for me
drugą sesję
to welcome you here at this session. We will begin that session with Mr. Van Rompuy's presentation. He's a Flemish, a Belgian politician, a Belgian MP, Minister of Finance, the Prime Minister of Belgium, and then the first permanent President of the European Council. Herman Van Rompuy, in his political life, has always been linked to Christian democracy. He was even the head of a Belgian party, a Christian Democratic Party. He's always tried to stress this aspect of values in politics. I was the Polish representative at the EU when Mr. Van Rompuy was the President of the European Council. And it was a pleasure to see and feel his attempt to implement these values in the political life of the political life. He has published a number of books. Mr. Jerzy Buzek, a former Prime Minister of Poland, is also with us. Welcome, sir. Jerzy.
I poza wszystkimi innymi zajęciami politycznymi
So, Herman Van Rompuy finds time for more than just politics, something which is not to be taken for granted. He writes and publishes haiku, which is a traditional Japanese form of poetry. He has published 2 volumes of such poems. And I could see was very engaging for the young people, because young people could see that politics must not be, or rather needs not be rigid, needs not be only something that deals with institutions only.
Merci de prendre la parole.
Mr. Ambassador and good friend Ján, it is because you invited me that I'm here. I'm thankful that I got this invitation and that I accepted this invitation. I see Jerzy Buzek, with whom I worked so closely together during his mandate as President of the European Parliament. Thank you, Jerzy, to attend this meeting, and especially my speech. Madam Commissioner of the European Commission, we only shared 1 month when I was President of the Council and you were a member for Poland in the European Commission. Ladies and gentlemen, I have prepared a text on the theme that Ján asked me to develop, and I will stick as most as possible to my text. It's easy for the translators, and it's easy for me. I hope that it is not boring, but in any case, it is a well-prepared text. Perhaps it can be useful to summarize a complex situation for the European Union and its member states, and complex for the world, in a few key words. That is possible without falling into simplism. And those words are unity, democracy, autonomy, long-term, and more Europe. Unity. We live in societies that are fragmented because individualization has become a feature of our times. Everybody has his, her, or her own truth, to quote the famous Italian writer Pirandello. There is, of course, nothing wrong with debate, nothing wrong with dissent, or with freedom of opinion and nothing wrong with emancipation, on the contrary. But there is a downside in terms of lack of open dialogue, and there is even a lot of enemy thinking. You are not my interlocutor, you are my enemy if you have another opinion than I have. There should always be openness to listen to others, and today that is less the case, unfortunately. The multiplicity and volatility of individual opinions and emotions translate into volatile election results and a fragmented political landscape with many political parties. In the Netherlands, they have 20 political parties represented in the parliament. It makes governing difficult at all levels of power, from the local to Europe. The crisis of democracies is linked to the crisis of societies. And this crisis of society is also visible in the deficits in mental well-being, burnout, depression, suicide, addictions, and especially among youngsters. I have no immediate solution to this, but we need to look lucidly at the world we live in. And these changes are changes in civilization, and they will not suddenly get resolved. Civilizations change slower than markets and slower than elections. The European Union is the sum of 27 member states, but also the sum of 27 divided societies. But the EU institutions are less blocked and more capable of making decisions than it is often said. That is a paradox. In the European Parliament, the President of the European Commission was elected very recently with a solid majority in the first round. The two far-right minority groups in the European Parliament represent only about 20% of the seats. You have the remaining 80%. Within populism, moreover, there are still important differences of policies. Not all of those populist parties are anti-Western or pro-Russia. Certainly not. The European Council of Heads of Government has mostly found consensus in recent years in spite of the fragmentation inside Europe. And it is not because a small country opposes that 98% of the rest of the Union is paralyzed. Unanimity is an uphill task, and you know that we need unanimity in the European Council of Heads of Government. Unanimity is an uphill task, but it has also been found every 6 months so far, for instance, for the sanctions against Russia. So we have a fragmentation all over Europe, but the institutions, the EU institutions, still function. Compared to the Union, the United States is even more heavily divided politically and has actually become an almost blocked society. Brexit split the UK into two camps, hostile to each other, not opposing, hostile to each other. In dictatorships, there is an apparent unity until the bomb bursts, as happened in 1989, when the Soviet Union broke up totally and unexpectedly. By the way, this is not the last time an empire or empires will disintegrate in the future. History is full of surprises. I have not to tell this in Poland. The next few years are bound to be tense for the European Union and its member states, because the two largest countries have become politically less stable internally. And this makes cooperation between France and Germany more difficult. The respective governments are permanently preoccupied with internal survival. The European Union has always needed the Franco-German engine, especially on socio-economic issues. We miss it today. The European Commission cannot fully take over that role because it can only make proposals. But the big decisions lie with the European Council of the 27 heads of government. And those big decisions will be needed to continue supporting Ukraine, to set up a European industrial policy, to cope with competition from the United States and China, to fight fierce climate change. Individual countries can never win that battle. We need much more European cooperation and integration. We don't need less Europe, we need more Europe. Will we have to do this with another kind of presidency in the United States by the end or the beginning of November? Question mark. Remember, we have seen a revival of the West, a revival of the Western G7 in the last 4 years, and a strong NATO that even welcomed 2 new members. In case of a regime change in America, the EU will have to take its fate into its own hands and become even more strategically autonomous or more sovereign. Unity, ladies and gentlemen, in itself is valuable, but it must be unity to achieve something, to get results for our citizens, to create a more prosperous, a more sustainable, and a happier society. My second key word is democracy. The next few years will not just be about the economy or the material, however important, but about values. And one of those values is democracy. For this, by the way, other values are indispensable, such as respect for every human person. Philosophically, I'm a personalist. Because I'm a Christian, I'm a personalist, but you shouldn't be a Christian to be a personalist. Indispensable values as the openness and dialogue, fundamental freedoms, rule of law and an independent judiciary, and fairness in the distribution of wealth and prosperity. Today, the trust, the faith of a part of our citizens, especially in Western Europe, it's around 20% in most of the countries. So the faith of a part of our citizens in democracy has declined sharply, going as far as preferring authoritarianism. However, the same skeptics of democracy cannot imagine that they will have to keep quiet on social media in an authoritarian regime, and that they will only be left with obedience. Obedience in a society where people were used to enormous freedoms. This addiction to debate reassures me about the future of democracy in the longer run. But we should not take risks. Today, pillars of democracy and the rule of law are under threat in a number of countries. The EU is cracking down on them, but what might happen if extremist parties made it in some big countries? Our democracies must be defended against internal enemies, and the parties of the center should only cooperate with pro-European, pro-Ukraine, and pro-democracy parties. People sometimes think that they are smart by cooperating with those parties that I just mentioned, but they dig their own graves. However, democracies must also pursue performing policies on security, purchasing power, illegal migration, and climate. Results will eventually convince people of the added value of democracies. We need the Europe of results. I emphasize democratic values because a Europe in the grip of extremists of all kinds would have major political repercussions also on foreign policy, also on the role of Europe in the world, and this could have a great, big geopolitically dramatic consequences. Domestic policy determines foreign policy, and security is not an isolated topic. You need a solid base politically and in terms of society at home. My third word is autonomy. For too long, many in the European Union have had a blind faith in the primacy of economics. There was a good reason for this. Trading with each other within the European Union makes us dependent from each other and countered the tendency to go to war. And we were extremely successful. After all, war would destroy the shared prosperity to which so many citizens were attached. The naivety was to think that was good, but that what was good for the European Union was also good for the world. It is not so, because for other global actors, there is the primacy not of the economic, the primacy of politics. Nationalism prevails. The primacy of the nation state, the opposite of what we are trying to do in the European Union. Moreover, in Russia, the drive for reconquest, the reconquista, the drive to restore the Soviet Empire prevails, also with weapons and at the costs of hundreds of thousands of human lives. A second reason for our naivety is that some countries do not play by the rules. They subsidize exports and investments or impose tariffs to make imported goods and services more expensive than the domestic ones. We have come to realize, after the 4 Trump years, after the invasion of Ukraine, and after the Chinese assertiveness, that we need to take our destiny much more in our own hands. We continue to believe in open markets as long as they do not jeopardize our security and if everyone abides by international agreements. Strategic sectors should not fall into the hands of not friendly countries and should be allowed to flourish in Europe itself. We are behind, we are lagging on, for instance, electric cars and artificial intelligence, and we have to catch up. Our climate policy towards renewable energy will make us much less dependent on imported fossil fuels. We have already largely and very quickly freed ourselves from Russian gas. We need to become more competitive, not so much through low costs, but through innovation and by forming powerful, large European companies. Scale, size matters globally. For example, on economic competition, we should not only look at whether some of our own companies are too dominant in our own single market, but we should ensure that our companies are large and competitive enough in global markets. At the same time, we need to create a true European capital markets union to provide also startups with sufficient funds in a timely manner. Mario Draghi confirmed what we already largely knew, but gave it a sense of urgency. If we want to be and remain strategically autonomous and prosperous, this will come at a price. We need to give the European Commission another chance to provide its own European funding, as we did in the COVID era with a fund of 800 billion euros. A number of countries have still not understood this and are prisoners of concepts of the past. It is not a time for calculators of national benefits and costs. It's time for European daredevils. Even in the EU, taboos have to fall. In the 60s, the then European Union, we called it the European Economic Community, was also lagging behind the US. We have made up our ground through Jacques Delors' single market in the 80s. Now we have less time than in the Delors period. Germany in particular needs to end the economic stagnation it has fallen into. Germany needs another economic miracle, another Wirtschaftswunder. By one country alone, but one country alone can no longer do that. That time has passed. The Draghi report is a long plea for more Europe, not less Europe. In short, we need to become much more autonomous and thus less dependent on military security, on food, energy, batteries, lithium, chips, artificial intelligence, migration, and others. This greater European sovereignty is not an end in itself, but the means to sustain the European social models and our democracies. We do not want to make Europe great again, but neither do we want it to be made small. My fourth word is long-term vision. Short-term thinking is typical of the current mentality in our democracies and of part of the business community. Regarding the latter, business community, the financial crisis has taught us how dangerous reckless behavior is. The pressure of stock market prices and of complacency are other causes of what we call short-termism. The European automotive industry missed the train of electric cars and is now condemned to a race to catch up. Growing societal individualization and political fragmentation automatically bring short-termism. After all, political parties have often become too small to take big risks needed for future-oriented projects. Climate policy is in function of the longer term, although we are already seeing today the negative consequences of climate change. I am, of course, thinking of the dramatic flooding in Central Europe, also in Poland, as we experienced it in the south of our country, in Belgium, in Wallonia, 2 years ago. The Commission proposed a courageous climate plan, the so-called Green Deal, and the Council and the Parliament followed it. As it became concrete, support from part of the population and from business decreased. Of course, there must be room for adjustments, but the direction and, where possible, the speed must be maintained. Climate is also too existential for humanity, or very existential for humanity. Therefore, it cannot be the subject of geopolitical rivalry. Cooperation on climate change, for instance with China, should be possible, because climate change is an existential problem for the human race. Long-term vision for the EU also entails decisively opting for its enlargement. Some member states look at enlargement with a calculator in their hands. They miss the bigger picture, a vision of Europe as a continent of peace and democracy, a continent of values. By enlargement, I mean mainly towards the countries of the Eastern Partnership, especially Ukraine and Moldova, and the Western Balkans, at least if the countries there really want it themselves. Of course, candidate members must respect what we call the acquis communautaire, all what we achieved since the beginning of the 50s in the European Union. Candidate countries must subscribe to the Union's common foreign and security policy and live the democratic values in word and deed. Ladies and gentlemen, we have enough problems with existing members not doing that. The 27 should recognize that Russia is trying to regain ground after losing in 1989, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the control over 100 million people on our continent alone. China itself lost much appeal in the European Union due to its, I'm quoting, friendship without limits with Russia and its hidden support for the invasion of Ukraine. China's construct of the 16+1 in Central Europe almost fell apart. As Europeans, we cannot be focused only on our own continent. And therefore, we must forge alliances on a global scale. In recent years, we concluded successful free trade agreements with Japan, with Vietnam, with Canada, with New Zealand. And it is unfortunate that the Mercosur agreement with Brazil and Argentina has not yet been finalized, partly also because of continuing objections within the European Union. We should not be naive, but neither should we be closed. I could also talk about Africa, with its immeasurable mineral resources and high potential for migration. Due to the gigantic population explosion, they have now 1.2 million inhabitants. They will have, by the end of this century, 4 billion. Again, we are taking initiatives in all those fields, also in Africa, but not convincing enough. A long-term view is not an intellectual concept, but a geopolitical or geoeconomic praxis. The war in Ukraine should definitively free us from sleepwalking. The consumer society makes us quickly succumb to easy solutions. There is no more business as usual. Those who cling too much to short-term stability by letting things go reap instability in the long run. The long term, has also a demographic dimension. The European Union, Russia, China, Korea, Japan, are facing more and more population decline and aging every year. We have known this for decades. Politics does not have much control over the number of births, although much more can be done on child-friendly family policies. The more productive we are, the less need there is for migration, compensating lower birth rates. I'm speaking about more productive in the economic sense of the word, of course. The former, the higher productivity relates to economic and industrial policy. I often mentioned the following figure in the past, long before the Draghi report was presented. Over the last 20 years, product per man-hour in the United States grew twice as fast as here. The digital revolution is not yet revolutionary enough in the Union. If we want to stop populism around migration, we have to opt for a bold policy that gets us out of the slow growth of productivity per man and per hour by fully engaging in the digital and environmental transition. This requires courage. Courage that the populist parties at least lack because they want to be popular. Don't forget, a populist wants to be popular. So higher productivity is not only a matter of economic and political survival, but also important for the internal stability of our societies. The more we are productive in economic terms, the higher our productivity, the less we are dependent on migration. We need also in this case more Europe. Individual countries alone cannot cope. And that brings me to my last key word, more Europe. Do we need a treaty for a better functioning of the European Union? Again, a treaty change. I would add that I myself am in favor of amendments in the treaty, for instance, of course, on the unanimity rule for major decisions that we take in the European Union. So we need amendments in the treaty rather than a general overhaul of the treaties. Indeed, much can be done without treaty changes by simply willing it, by a coalition of the willing. Moreover, it is necessary to know well that reforms are needed without getting caught up in a general institutional debate, a debate that divides member states and citizens at a dangerous time when we need unity. We need unity, and a big debate on new institutions will divide us instead of bringing us together. For the sake of unity, it is also not a good idea to weaken the pillars of the Union by reintroducing national border controls and endangering the Schengen zone. We also need to further strengthen the economic and monetary union, that other pillar of the European Union. Little work has been done over the last 12 years. The priority today is the European Capital Markets Union, as I mentioned already. The European Council intends to reach an agreement on this soon. Let's hope. The third pillar, the single market, the largest single market in the world, is not yet enough unified, not enough single. And Nicoletta's report pointed this out very well. All this does not mean that nothing has happened in the Union to achieve all these objectives mentioned in this account. On the contrary, a number of reforms, such as the CHIPS Act, the Critical Raw Materials Act, and the Pact on Asylum and Migration, are in progress. Evidence of this are the increase in defense budgets and the strengthening of military cooperation within NATO and within the Union. Evidence is also the support we are giving to Ukraine. The question is whether it is enough. We must also be prepared for the possibility of unforeseen developments that will necessitate a unified and forceful response. I'm thinking of a possible change of power in the US and all its consequences on the war in Ukraine, which is an existential task for the European Union and possibly an existential threat. And that is why we need strong European institutions and strong member states. It is possible that we may react more united and more stronger than feared, as we did in the pandemic and in the first months of the Russian invasion. As a matter of fact, the Union has surprised many throughout its young history, actually in the COVID times and in the first period of the Ukrainian war, we surprised ourselves by our unity. Ladies and gentlemen, to conclude, I'm a man of hope. We badly need hope, this great Christian virtue. We need hope. Hope is a verb. It is not passive, but active. We have to be the creators of our own hope. Hope is the opposite of fear. Hope is life, and fear is death. That's why I remain a man of hope. Thank you so much.
Bardzo serdecznie dziękujemy panu przewodniczącemu.
Mr. President, thank you very much for your paper. You have managed to combine deep political practice with your reflection that extends itself towards the future. This is a great introduction to panel that we are going to begin right now. May I ask the panelists to join me? I'll do that in a moment. We will be reflecting on what the EU expansion did to you, how the EU can meet the citizens' expectations and challenges that we are facing. May I ask our guests, Minister Adam Szłapka. He's responsible for the European integration in the government. He's a politician. Now he's a member of the ruling coalition. He's responsible for our preparation for the presidency. Madam Bieńkowska, a former Deputy Prime Minister, a former Commissioner. She is with us, ready to discuss issues, and Ján Figel, a Slovak politician, a Christian Democrat, a former minister, and the main Slovak negotiator in the negotiations to join the EU, a former commissioner. He's a politician who is involved in discussions on how we should respond today to global challenges and how to promote Christian values. How to promote those Christian values in the world where those values are not always ready and welcome, which is something that links us back to the previous discussion. Firstly, let us follow up on what President Van Rompuy has said in his speech. Mr. President spoke of what the EU needs today. My question to you, dear panelists, is as follows. It's been 20 years now since this EU enlargement, and those new countries had this gift, namely their experience of totalitarianism. Now, 20 years, how this period has changed how the EU works and how it changed the balance of power in the EU. I will begin with Madam Bieńkowska. You are a former commissioner and you worked as a commissioner under the presidency of Jean-Claude Juncker. And you basically were an insider. You saw how our club works and how the Central European countries' opinions and messages got into this European mechanism. Yes, I've seen all that. This part of Europe has been a part of the European Union for 2 decades now. Only after February 2022, our voices are actively and attentively being listened to. Yes, this region has been catching up with the rest of the European Union members. Now, we are no longer a new member state. You can see it quite clearly. You can see it here in Poland, how Europe has changed. I started with defense, but let me move on to economy. At a certain point, we became a strong economic partner to other member states. President Van Rompuy said that the single market is not all that single. And, you know, when we gained some strength, you could see these protectionist tendencies in the old member states. This is what I experienced for 5 years. Yes, they spoke of the single market, but also we heard that it's not all that single and common. It's something that we've been hearing for quite some time. What truly changed Europe is what happened in 2022. There were certain steps that had been taken ever since Juncker's presidency. We had a very small budget. The defense budget, this budget was very small indeed, but in 2022 everybody started speaking about this major issue. This is the EU perspective, though. We have listened to Mr. President's speech in a moment, and I believe that this particular decade will be decisive for the world order as such. Mr. President has talked about economy, about the digital issues, about this material aspect, about defense, about the military aspect. In all these areas, domains, we're entering a new era. Ever since World War II, Europe had not experienced anything like that. Throughout all this year, the US had been the guarantor of world safety, and Europe was the beneficent of free trade and free flow of goods. We are living in the richest and up to a point safest corner of the world. Now, I keep referring to what Mr. President said. Sir, you spoke about this speed, about this pace. You can see it very clearly in Draghi's report. Europe needs to change entirely in a number of ways, in a number of areas. The voice of Europe, or rather, the voice of this part of Europe is being listened to differently to the way it was before February 2022. The same question to Ján Figel. What's the Slovak perspective here? What's your point of view? Because we see certain challenges, but your perception of those challenges may be somewhat different. Because there is this group of people that joined the EU in 2004, and your perspective is going to be somewhat different. Jan, thank you. Hello. Welcome, all friends. In Polish, I'm not such a great orator. And the subject is very important, but so I'm going to switch to English.
As a friend, as a neighbor, as a European, I think that after 20 years, or since the largest historical enlargement, 2004, 2024, we have a new generation, young people who cannot remember the divided Europe. We have to remember. We have to give testimony. Enlarged union, instead of 15, now 27, could be 28, but Brexit, yes, confirms it's open community, free community. It's possible also to live. That's a real theme. It's not a theory. Brexit confirms openness in both directions, unfortunately, but that's reality. We are a free community. But with Poland, Slovakia, Czech Republic, Hungary, and all countries acceding after Cold War, union is more European, more complete, not complete. We didn't, mission is not achieved, mission is not accomplished. We were slow, very slow. 15 years since the collapse of the Berlin Wall, 15 years it took to get into the community. Long time. And after all this, now, 34, 35, 3 years, the reasons for European integration are reconfirmed. The original one was war in Europe, to prevent war between France and Germany and those who will take part. We have succeeded. There is no war between 27 or even 28. But there is war in Europe again. Tragic war, bloody. We discuss here, but young people in the East daily, on daily basis, kill in fratricide. I don't want to speak on events there, but it's part of a call for better Europe. Europe understanding source of peace. It's justice. It's not just business. Justice. Peace is fruit of justice. Justice among people, among nations. And the second reason is even more visible, strong than it was then, 30 years ago. It's globalization. President Van Rompuy mentioned we need to cooperate and to compete with the United States. They have comparatively very low prices in energy sector, different interests in many sectors. Then there is a rise in China and BRICS and so on. We can continue. So Europe cannot be a nice museum or a commemoration of history, but a community which is advancing for mutual benefit. I think innovation was mentioned. When I was commissioner in the first 5 years, with the support of Jerzy Buzek and the EIT friends, mandated by José Manuel Barroso, I was invited to establish MIT in Europe. MIT is very, traditional, strong institution. It's Massachusetts Institute of Innovations, of Technology. And it has over 160 years now. It was a very difficult theme, very difficult objective. But we have succeeded to establish in 2008 EIT, which is located in Budapest, it's European Institute for Innovations and Technology. And after 15 years, which is a teenager age, our kids have this age, it is kicking, growing, running, and it's a must. We have to innovate, which means to do more for less money, for less energy, for less consumption. Schuman was a great innovator. Adenauer spoke a lot about innovations. European Union is political innovation per se. Par example. But we can spoil it. We can, of course, damage human potential if we don't act reasonably in cooperation towards justice, in truth. Truth liberates. If we want to be free, we must live in truth, not in ideology, not in lies. We know it, we should remember it. So there are several values which are crucially decisive for our success and future. And with enlargement, I think we have contributed to these values. Schuman spoke on 4. It was dignity, freedom, equality, and solidarity, which lead to peace among people, lead to peace among nations. And we need to strengthen this export or support of these values in the east of Europe, in Balkans, and of course outside around our continent. So basically, enlarged union is more European, and that's for good.
Panie ministrze, to teraz do pana się zwracam.
Minister, now the next question. What are the conclusions that the current Polish government is drawing, observing the current condition of the European Union? And what are the perhaps main objectives for the Polish government for the coming months and years in this context? Thank you very much. First of all, I wish to thank you for addressing your invitation to me to join this panel discussion. Speaking about the 20 years, I would like to start actually referring to what Mr. Van Rompuy has said here, reminding us the fundamental values so important for the process of the creation of the EU.
Yes, the idea of the founding fathers was to bring peace and stability to the continent of Europe. And then, well, we've come to realize that development is also accelerated once such values are adhered to. Well, I remember very well 2004, 20 years ago, when we were joining the European Union. I was actually 19 at that time. The EU referendum was actually the first referendum or election I participated in. I remember the emotions at that time. There were huge emotions in Poland. We felt we were part of the world of values, the world of democracy, the world that was developing at that time. And this was, I think, the main reason why we were voting for. I remember at that time there was discussion about what we were contributing to the EU at that time. Ambassador Tombiński also mentioned that. I remember this emotion of new life, as if that was to be injected into this community. Joy, feeling that we have achieved the aspirations that generations of people living in Central and Eastern Europe have been having for decades. That we were joining the European community of values. Europe at that time, the whole world, were completely different from what they are today. We all remember, certainly. We all have our memories of 2004. Well, it seems to me it was not so long time ago, but once we pause and we think about, for instance, the phones we were using at that time, you could have, well, a huge phone that could be used as a hammer, perhaps, to nail or put a nail in the wall, but certainly there was no way you could surf on the internet. And the share of Europe at that time was 25% of the GDP, and then Putin was only just starting as president in Russia, and everyone seemed that, well, we would be working very closely together with Russia. At that time, Leonid Kuchma was president of Ukraine. So again, I'm mentioning it to show that the world was very much different. It seemed that the United States were guaranteed long leadership in the world. Now the world is different. Entering the European Union, just like the other member states, new member states at that time, we were, I think at that time, already feeling that we were one of the best, that we would do our best to show everyone that we would cope well, that we would be good pupils of the new club. And the way we succeeded, I think Poland, but other countries as well, maybe we have achieved even more than we expected at that time. Gigantic, I would use this word, gigantic economic development for us. We often speak about the take-up of the EU funds in Poland, but the truth is that the main driving force for the economic development of Poland was an excellent way in which we were able to use, we and our entrepreneurs, to use the European single market, where we did very well. Poland, Polish companies in Europe. Of course, the EU funds were yet another element contributing to the boosting of our economy. But as you have asked me about my conclusions, well, now we have 20 years of our experience inside the European Union. We are no longer a new member state. Well, 20 years. Seems we know quite well the internal mechanisms of the EU. We are top 5, belong to the top 5 as for the number of population. We have a large economy. Our institutional experience is also significant. We also remember the process of accession at that time, so we also have very good institutional memory of the strategic process for the EU to develop. Yes, I agree that the enlargement has made Europe more complete today, but we are not complete at the same time. We are not in the final shape, and I think what makes us stronger is still this chance to further enlarge. Everyone knows that what we've been talking for 20 years about Russia, about threats from Russia, was quite serious. We've now all come to realize that this was a tangible threat that was not perhaps before taken seriously. So certainly we are not just a new student in class doing their best to excel in this classroom, but we are now, I think, one of the hard players in the EU that can, well, I think, aspire to be one of the key players at the table. And as for the conclusions, again, we've got a chance now to shape the European agenda. This has been there for quite some time. The conference yesterday, the meeting of Prime Minister Tusk with the Prime Ministers of Slovakia, the Czech Republic, and Chancellor of Austria, and Ursula von der Leyen showed this process of shaping our common agenda. At the same time, I think, just as Commissioner Bieńkowska said, it's time for us to take responsibilities for our own security. The times have changed. We should not be just waiting, worrying about the results of the US election, but we have to act. We have to take responsibility into our own hands. This is going to be one of the key elements of our presidency, Polish presidency in the EU. First of all, we have to focus on security, including military security. Additionally, a full-scale invasion of Russia in Ukraine. It is not the only, certainly, front that builds threats from Russia. There are hybrid threats along the border. There are acts of sabotage in different locations, disinformation. So this internal security is going to be yet another important dimension. Thirdly, economic security. Mr. President spoke about that before. We have to focus on being competitive in Europe when compared to, for instance, China, also the United States. Fortunately, it seems that more and more people realize this is a serious challenge. We got letters and Draghi's reports. Excellent. Additionally, energy security. The war in Ukraine has shown to us that it's very much about our European sovereignty. But yet another dimension that sometimes we omit is food security. If the whole world were safe and democratic, there would be no problems with imports. But certainly we need our internal resilience in food safety as well. Food safety and food security. So certainly the dynamics are changing, and all of us, all new member states entering the EU, I think we have grown. We feel now more and more secure within the EU. We realize that we can have a say in the European agenda, and also we feel that we can take responsibility for Europe into our hands. It is time, I think, for Europe as a whole to take responsibility for the future of Europe. Minister, please keep the microphone, because I'm going to address yet another question to you. Could you please come up with some comments on the following issue? We've got problems with turnout in Poland, the European elections. It seems that not enough is being said about EU. We don't have any strong European movements. There was something called Mouvement Européen some time ago. But today, actually, it's difficult to find strong social support for different ideas, European ideas. How should we actually speak to people in our country? It's our task, I think, to speak about Europe and European challenges.
Let me go back to what happened in Poland 20 years ago. Here, now in Poland, we are trying to restart this movement jointly with Minister Nowacka. There are two things here. Firstly, yes, we are much stronger in the EU. Now, 2004 was a beautiful time, lots of enthusiasm, lots of joy. At this point, though, our presence in the EU should be par for the course. It's normal. And no longer should we, in our discussions, rely on only emotions. We are for, we are against. It is easier to build these anti-European emotions when you have such two camps. We should put it differently. It is in our national interest to be in Europe. Why? Because it makes us safer. One person is going to say that. But populists in Poland will say, no, no, NATO makes us stronger. They will say, not so. You see, if all interstate relationships is only a power play, then look at all the connections between the EU and NATO. An attack on any EU country is a threat to the stability of all. We are safer all together because it's in our interest to protect one another. That was the first thing. Second, we are richer because there is this single European market. I can see that I need to pick up my pace. It is simply in our interest, the single European market, the funds, the capital, people, services can flow. Why am I saying that? It should be in our interest now for Europe to be a part of our normalcy. We are Polish. We are in Poland or in another European state. It is normal for us. And still we criticize an institution or a government in power, but never do we dream of leaving this country. And I think that this is the right approach. That's where we should go. Now, the politicians in the European institutions and member states should do the following. We should have this relationship strengthened between the European core and the residents, because this link, this rapport is almost broken. We need to build the agenda in a way that would be understandable to citizens. Let's take climate policy as an example. We need to move away from Europe, from the Europe of bans to the Europe of support and various initiatives. I think that would be more natural, and that would boost the support for various policies, and we would take the oxygen away from the biggest threat in Europe, that is populists. Jan, the same question to you. You have been running for the European Parliament, rather. What arguments did you use? What arguments did you use to reach out to your Slovak voters? Jan, thank you very much.
Europe matters, and it's very important to commemorate that 20 years ago it was also about emotion, return to Europe as a long-term objective or generational desire. Now it's more practical daily issue, but again, what I was speaking about in the campaign was war in the East. We have a lot of refugees, we have impact of war, we have, all risks, including major war again in Europe. 3 wars which started in Europe in the 20th century became global. La Grande Guerre, Second World War, and then Cold War. Started as European division, European conflict. We have again this threat very present. Then I spoke on religious freedom because I was first European envoy for freedom of religion or belief. In time of ISIS rise or war on terror, and especially events after 2014-15 in Iraq and Syria, it is very important as a measure against illegal migration or pressures on Europe, but especially for human dignity in the world, because the deepest expression of human freedom is freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, and freedom to believe or not to believe. This is the deepest. Then I have freedom of opinion, of expression, of assembly, of association, of property. But freedom of conscience, freedom to believe or not to believe, is the base of human dignity. And we should be a protagonist of human dignity. If you look to European Charter, #1 principle or chapter #1 is human dignity. Value #1 is dignity. So Poland should be full of examples of defense of human dignity. Slovakia as well. If we are united on these values, we are contribution. If we are divided because we don't care, we abandon, we don't remember, we are simply traders, how can we help the others? So I spoke on this, then I spoke on Sunday without politics, because during campaign our Prime Minister was almost killed, and it was the second attempt. The previous one was in a way successful, but the killer didn't find Prime Minister Heger, and then he killed 2 young guys in Bratislava. So political violence becomes part of Slovak reality. And we cannot afford it, we cannot allow it, we must do something. So this was my campaign. I made the largest jump in the campaign from the last position to the fourth, but it was not enough, and I'm here and I have more time to deal with other issues. But Europe matters, and we cannot be only consumers. We consumed a lot, and peace cannot be prevented for future by consumerism or consumist attitudes. We have to act, we have to work. My father would love to have my crisis, financial, institutional, legal, political. He had no freedom. I remember half of life I lived under communism. Ján Figel in the previous generation was eliminated without traces, my uncle. We don't know where he's buried. Which place? Gulag in the east or somewhere in Slovakia. So this was my campaign, and this is my permanent campaign in my life, because free and whole Europe was a dream. It was not utopia. In the morning I heard here's apologetics on utopia. United Europe was a dream. Konrad Adenauer said it was a dream of a few, desire of many, and became necessity for all. Our desire, we got it as a gift, but we have to value it, defend it, and to promote it. So this is my campaign.
Dziękuję bardzo. I jeszcze się zwracam.
So very much, Madam Commissioner. Minister, Deputy Prime Minister, Commissioner, you have worn these hats. So let's talk about the reactions of citizens, residents. I had my scope of tasks. People that I talked to were mostly entrepreneurs because they complained about the single market not being all that single. This was this chorus that I kept hearing again and again. So how do we talk about Europe? That's a difficult question. All institutions have been trying hard. They invest money in it, and yet we see what is happening. Now, let me go back to that chorus. What we need in Europe right now is a huge revolution. We need a huge leap forward in a number of different areas, starting with security, via economy, expansion, naturally too. We will see how long it's going to take. A few months ago, people said that it's going to take fast. Now they say it's a merit-based process. But merit-based process was a process that in Poland took 10 years or even longer. So you have to consider that. I deeply believe that right now Poland should be one of those countries that no longer talks about how beneficial, financially beneficial Europe is for us. Rather, we should start talking about what Europe should be like in the next few years, because it's going to be different. Europe needs to change. Draghi, basically, he beseeched us to change. Without that, Europe will stay adrift, and people will come here only to see museums. What we need in a number of areas is a Copernican revolution. Firstly, in how we think about defense. In October, in a few weeks' time, there'll be another report. There was the single market report, very interesting. But there's nothing new there. There was Draghi's report too, which is this cry to us. We need to change. If we don't, we will fall behind. And our single market is the biggest one. We're talking about 400 million consumers. There is no such a market in the world. In October, Minister's report will be issued. He's a Finnish politician, about security and how Europe should prepare to become more secure. And it's going to be about the money that we need to invest in security, and there is a huge question mark there. There was a question mark 10 years ago when they started. There's another question mark. How is it going to be aligned with NATO? For years, we've heard about it. Macron spoke of strategic autonomy, didn't he? Madam President spoke of this geopolitical commission. It bears different names. Now, I believe that Poland is in a position that it no longer talks only about cohesion funds. Yes, they are important, but what is more important for Poland to find itself in this community for 10 years' time? Technology revolution is also something very important. It impacts people, does it not? Here in Poland, we can be proud of our values. A year ago, we showed how we understand values. It was another reminder thereof. Now, when you speak to people about Europe, they see borders, they think of Erasmus, they see people getting richer. These are tangible things that they see. Out of 20 years, we had 8 years of Eurosceptics rule here. So even more, you say, 10 years, you say. It was a huge loss, but an important lesson, because we see that our society values values. And whatever was important for us when we entered is still important. We need to take another step. Mr. President spoke of that. Our internal policy is projected onto foreign policy. Member states need to understand it, that only united, strong Europe can be effective. It needs to defend European values and European interests. Only that can bring prosperity to the next generations. It's a prerequisite, because so far we've had all these protectionist mechanisms. And let me reiterate that. We need not be reminded of values here in Poland. What people see are benefits, tangible benefits. They need to see economic benefits. They need to see benefits in terms of security and migration. This is how you talk about Europe. That's the way. Yeah, I keep starting certain themes and then I never finish. I know, sorry about that. I started talking about this technological revolution. It's something that we live in. But you know that very well. It's something that has changed, transformed our societies immensely. People have 100 different sources of information. They can pick and choose which one is real or not. That is something that's changed the way we speak, we talk to people. You need to come to terms with that. We need to come to terms with that. 3 billion, I believe, is the number, or maybe 8. 8 billion devices connected to the internet. In a few years' time, it's going to be well over 100 billion devices. And that impacts societies, our sociology, how we approach work, how people get anxious about losing their jobs because of robotization and AI. This is something that we need to talk to about people. Mr. Ambassador, when you ask me how do I do that, I've no idea. Because you need to reach out to people, use different channels.
Well, I think what you are saying shows to us that Europe is still in creation, a process in creation. We don't have very often ready-made answers. No, we don't have answers because, yes, Europe is changing shape all the time and it can be transformed. In many cases, we have seen cases of changes when 2 new member states are joining in, then 2 again. It has shown that the Europe can change, and now we have to change again. Before I give the floor to our guests, everyone in the room here will be able to ask questions, but a few words about values. protecting values is not only about protecting values within the EU, but also, for instance, we protect values when helping Ukraine, or when we speak about the enlargement. We very often say that there's yet another front where we try to defend European values. Could you still say very briefly a few more words about how to respond to the different expectations in this area? Those who very often die today for their aspiration to become part of Europe, or those who have been waiting for years in a waiting room somewhere, not really knowing when they will be able to join in. Minister. Thank you very much. Yes, we speak here about a number of different states. So we've got Western Balkan states, Ukraine, Moldova, the closest perhaps to the enlargement, but there are others as well. Ukraine, I think, is the best example here. Let us remember the so-called Orange Revolution there. It was there, it started when the big enlargement actually took place. It was obviously related, those events were very clearly related. The borders of the EU came so close to Ukraine that it changed the position of the EU population. Not everyone, certainly, but a significant part for a certain generation of young Ukrainians. It was a very important event. Almost 10 years later, as you mentioned it, you spoke about dignity, the so-called revolution of dignity in Ukraine that broke out exactly at the time when President Yanukovych refused to sign the association agreement. So those emotions related to values in Ukraine, but not only, those emotions play a very important role. And now, what can we do, especially in this context of war now? It seems that we, all of us basically, all member states are acting here. Poland plays a special role. But let us give a very strong political signal to other countries that the door to the EU is open, that it's a strategic interest of Europe to continue with the enlargement. This was clearly, in my view, stressed in February 2022. Then, with the sanctions, certainly new packages of sanctions have shown those aspirations also. As also you have said, Europe can change. Europe can also take action. Would we, well, let's say in 2021, would anyone be able to imagine a situation in which Germany would be sending tanks? Well, in Poland, maybe it was easier to imagine, but can you imagine, well, again, Germany, European Union financing purchase of weapons or ammunition for Ukraine? And it happened. Then the significant packages of help, assistance for Ukraine, the profit from frozen Russian assets going to Ukraine. So very strong political signals. Additionally, something that was not maybe so well publicized, but an intergovernmental conference, representatives of member states plus Ukraine and Moldova, we decided together that we were starting association or negotiations, starting negotiations for the final day when Ukraine and Moldova will become part of the EU. So I think that if we want to act again united, not to bring any harm to Ukraine, well, I'm convinced that this process of enlargement, it has to be a process that is not only political, but it has to be merit-based, certainly. We know how much we have benefited. Poland is a country where we introduced many reforms during the accession process, when we implemented the acquis, when we kept changing our Polish economy, we were changing our internal institutions. And now, after we have seen in Hungary, for instance, drawing on our experience also of the 8 years of populist government in power in Poland, when opening the first cluster of negotiations with Ukraine, the so-called fundamentals, we certainly need to have this magnifying glass and explain to our partners in Ukraine that the ball is in your hands. You need to fulfill some expectations, and this process of reforms is in your interest of the Ukrainians, because if we open the door to a country that would not be ready from the point of view of institutions, it's going to be bad for this state, because the state is not going to continue its reforms, and at the same time it's going to be, I think, a mortal threat for the whole of Europe. So values, yes, Certainly, we had two revolutions that stressed the importance of values. As for the member states and the whole EU, there has to be a very clear political message to be sent. We have to assist our partners, but the process is in the hands of the Ukrainians. We have to stress that. They have to take action. Internal reforms in the country are needed. We all want changes to be rapid, but rapid, it does not mean that we are going to turn a blind eye to things that are not done properly. Yes, I quite agree, but at the same time, hopefully, we are not going to lead to a situation in which the Balkan states have found themselves. For more than a decade, they are kept in the waiting room, and what is happening? The West Balkans, well, as you can see, is waiting. Long waiting brings about some results, geopolitical changes. In Serbia, Russia is more and more active. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, different Arab states, also Russia in Montenegro, although Montenegro is part of NATO. So, well, we have to, I think, because as you know, the negotiations have started, but there is a need, I think, to have this tangible timeline. I remember years ago I was in Serbia as a Polish minister, and Serbia was actually doing well. It was fulfilling different conditions for accession. And then, well, the whole process was very lengthy, and I think it's a terrible example of what happened in the Western Balkans. We all certainly want to have an enlargement of the stable, free world. From our perspective, it's quite clear, I think. There is this political message that have been sent. But before IGC on the 25th of June, at the meeting of ministers for Europe, we are in Kiev, Odessa, and Chisinau. We visited those cities. In Kiev, apart from meeting Prime Minister Stefanishin, there was this clear support for European aspirations. We also had a meeting with institutions responsible for corruption, NABU, anti-corruption prosecutors, anti-corruption court. And what was the message that we got, actually, we ministers of the Weimar Triangle? We were told we have to reform. It's not only about us joining the EU for being there, they were saying, but we want to be in the European Union and have similar standards. We don't want to enter the EU as we were joining the communist organization of countries, but we want to change. And they actually, the anti-corruption bodies in Ukraine, wanted us to have a very strong position when speaking to Ukrainian authorities to fight corruption. This is a serious problem still, corruption there. No one actually speaks about blocking any country in their European aspirations. We wanted the process to be moved forward, but at the same time, we had to introduce, we remember in Poland, many difficult reforms, many changes. If we had not done it, we would not join the EU. And what about Slovakia? You're also close to Hungary. What is your perspective from Slovakia? And perhaps a few words about Hungary. Well, the Hungarians, as you know, Poles and Hungarians are traditionally treated as brothers. Well, but Slovaks are closer and the Hungarians are further away for us now.
You must be integrated, not divided. Then it goes on through neighborhood. And I speak about enlargement because with neighbors we live. To Brussels we travel a lot, but we live with neighbors. And integrated Europe means good coexistence or even unity with neighbors. And then it's continental dimension. So it starts at home and gets back at home to Poland, to Slovakia, Visegrad. Where is Visegrad today? It was a dream, a vision to dismantle the past in 1991, 3 in Bratislava, Wałęsa, Havel, and Gönc. To dismantle the structures, the institutions of the past, and to build new Europe. Okay, so we did the first homework in Visegrad group, but we didn't succeed in the completion or building new Europe. Second, I want to say that all these 3 wars I mentioned previously, and enlargement was a response to the Cold War, end of Cold War, Annus Mirabilis, started in Sarajevo, 1914, summertime, Sarajevo, attentat, and then war. We were not able, in more than 100 years, to get peace back to Sarajevo, not peace as appeasement, armistice, but as institutional coexistence with neighbors. European Union is a peace project, and this project is still not in Sarajevo in full terms of participation. It's also our homework. And then Ukraine was already covered, I will say. Next week I have long official interview with Ukrainians as former chief negotiator on accession to share advice, experience, knowledge, know-how from the process of accession to our biggest neighbor now in bloody war. It's a special case. It's a case also for us to learn how to deal with the situation and to become, as I said before, not only consumers of peace, but producers of peace. This is much more demanding, more mature Europe, and it's our generation which should prove that we don't only get funds and peace and values, but bring the answers to justice and peace in east of Europe. And this is win-win task. This would be good for us, not only for somebody else. So last comment maybe, there is a lot now about defense and security. European integration counted on security. Robert Schuman in 1949 signed Washington Treaty on North Atlantic Organization, NATO, later on, which is going on and enlarging, 49. In 49, in Strasbourg, was founded Council of Europe as umbrella or institution for democracy, rule of law, human rights, with the convention, with the court in Europe. Great, unique, globally unique legacy, our legacy, we got it. And in 1954, French government, Pleven, proposed European defense community, defense. But it was refused at the end of ratification process by Assemblée Nationale because of Germany. The French, then with Gaulle and communists, were afraid of Germany in the EDF. So in 1954, West Germany, with Adenauer, was admitted to NATO, and then Warsaw Pact, not here, but in Warsaw, was established as a counter-organization of Stalinist bloc. We have to remember and to do now what we did not do 10, 20, or even 70 years ago. It is our role, it is our interest. Thank you.
Thank you. Dziękuję bardzo i teraz przekazuję mikrofon.
Thank you very much. I would like to now open our discussion. A number of people raising their hands. Maybe let us start here. And if there are questions, I understand that Mr. President Van Rompuy is with us. He can also ask or answer questions. Mr. Cebulski, formerly Economic University in Wrocław, Statistical Office, member of Team Europe Direct. Two issues, if I can, some of the last ones. The last one was about enlargement. Commissioner Bieńkowska, among others, spoke about this waiting room. The countries of the Western Balkans, they can get even more radicalized because they are still there in the waiting room. A freezer, some say, and it seems there are no easy answers there. Minister Szłapka also mentioned that those countries do not fulfill the standards that were defined as the so-called Copenhagen criteria. Also, the acquis communautaire has not been fully adopted by those countries. And now it seems that it's also something that is changing all the time. Remember Turkey, the fate of Turkey in the freezer since 1960s. The country is radicalized. Please ask questions, concrete questions, asks the moderator. So the first question I have is on what to do actually, what kind of information policy is needed for us, the one linked to the European Union. We need to show perhaps that the traditional model, the model when we spoke about, well, let's say we are using cohesion funds and we are getting so much money from Brussels. Yes, we can speak about that, but that's not enough, I think. We can do different calculations showing how much has changed, how Poland has developed thanks to European funds, from the 40% of the EU average to we reached 80% now, roughly. But we often forget about something else, about the internal market. It's not very popular, perhaps, not often discussed in the media. So I think that we should focus maybe on the internal market now. It's not only the Draghi report, but the barriers, access barriers for the internal market are quite significant still, especially for free flow of services, also for public procurement. Question, please question. It's not really a question, but a conclusion on my part. We had some fears in the old days that once we join the European Union, we will not be able to be competitive with others, that our Polish products will not sell in the EU. Now, actually, we have a positive balance, trade balance, 365 billion. With the developing countries, it's different. What would happen were we not in the EU? What level, economic development level would we have? This is an open question to everyone. I think that the government could also focus, and those interested in dealing with information should focus on that, focus on the internal market and its role for us.
Right. The number has not been mentioned. So the benefits from the single market. Well, 5 times more than what we get from the cohesion fund. Let me reiterate it. I dealt with the single market. Up to a point, the Polish entrepreneurs in this initial period benefited from it as much as they could. But then it turned out that they were really competitive, and in a number of areas they were better than their foreign competitors. Then this tug of war started. There was a lady who had raised her hand before, but I cannot see. There she is. Madam, thank you. Sławomira Zbielska. Salame. I'm a sociologist from the US. I'm Polish. I still feel Polish. But professionally speaking, biologically speaking, I spent most of my life in the US. Today, we've heard about this threat a number of times, this threat linked to the US elections. Here, we've been stressing the value in democracy. The US shows to us that, yes, we value democracy, but we should also see that the system is fragile, vulnerable. Let's look at the US, the last decade. Whatever we saw as a, foundation that these checks and balances, these checks and balances are no longer working there. And there is this shift to activate people at the local level. Madam Commissioner, you were quite frank because you spoke that this particular decade, this decade is incredibly important. And I'm hearing you, I understand that globalization is important, the EU is important, and the EU is a supranational entity important for our security. But there is also this other side of the coin, that is, we need to make what is local viable, because there was this centralization process going on for a long time. However, when you want to gain support for important political programs such as this Green Deal, which is losing popularity, for that to work, we need to teach our voters that those programs are in their local interests. I understand there was a comment, not a question. So we are waiting for questions. So a question now. You are in the EU. Do you believe it's justified to build localism as a counterweight to centralization, as a counterweight to building strong EU? I think in Poland it really worked, and thanks to that we had a certain result in our elections because a number of institutions, social groups felt empowered. Only recently, it had been 35 years since this first step, which started this avalanche, 1989. So it is all about people becoming subjects rather than objects. This is the path to democracy, is it not? The lady in one of the last rows. Madam, hello. Alina Kozińska, Federacja Inicjatyw Oświatowych, Education Initiatives Federation. Ever since Mr. Buzek's rule, we have been dealing with education, grassroots movements therein, and we are really, really good at it. Now, we want to show that during the Polish presidency. And now I'm moving to my question. Ladies and gentlemen, please take a look at what Wales did, what the Netherlands did, what Finland did in terms of education policy. But we are even better in this regard than Finns, because Finns invited us to speak to their parliament. Please help us so that we can get in touch with Jane Davidson, a minister in the Welsh government, and a number of other people. Because what we want is for the conference that we're preparing here to be of really high quality. And 9 billion is supposed to go to miners this year. We were happy to take over this money from them so that we can move this money to the educational efforts. So that's great. That's great. That's a great question. I'm just wondering whether anyone is going to take this question and answer that. But we will pass it on, won't we? But please ask questions, Iwala Sadecka. For a decade, I was a spokesperson. When it comes to strategic communication and this point where society meets policy, it's all very important, close to my heart. Mr. President, Madam Commissioner have mentioned that this is a new era that we are looking at, the new era in the EU. Mr. Minister, you've mentioned that for the last 20 years we have seen a new generation grow up. So my question is, let's talk about actions. The title of the conference is The New Shape of Europe, and we need to work with the new generation. We need to speak to the new generation. People younger than us need to be active, to actively participate in it. Mr. Minister, speaking of the presidency, what are the plans? What are you planning to engage this new generation that has grown in the last 20 years and their older friends? What can be done to make them engaged? I believe that here in Poland, people don't even know that the Polish presidency begins on January the 1st. So what can be done? What tangible can be done? What is the communication strategy that is there in this regard? By no means am I going to say that I belong to the young generation, because I understand that you are asking about people who are younger than myself. But I do remember when Poland entered the EU. I was 19 at the time. What we were the most upset about at the time is this paternalistic approach. People would say, we will come up with a strategy to engage you, the young ones. It was really upsetting. The product needs to be interesting. The product needs to be interesting. If it's not interesting, nobody will come up with a strategy to interest the young people. That's the first thing. Secondly, nobody is asking how to ask 50-year-olds to be involved, because we remember that people are different, even from the same generation. So it is difficult to find one single stake, one single interest. Even in the same generation, people have different interests and professions and experience and so on and so forth. What should we focus on then? Here I'm speaking about communication. We need to use our presidency as a tool to impact the European agenda. The agenda needs to be built in a way that it's going to be as useful as possible for the future of Poland and Europe. And in this sense, it should be attractive also to the young generation. Speaking of priorities, when we speak of priorities, we mostly speak about safety and security. But security is also about resilience. We need to be resilient to this major threat in the EU, that is populism. We need to respond to disinformation, and there are new communication channels that are being used there. Europe needs to be closer to citizens, so it's about programs that are aimed at people who are becoming adults. Socrates, Erasmus. I remember that we benefited from those programs. My generation when Poland was entering the EU. I would be very cautious. I would tread cautiously when you speak of the strategy to reach out to the new generation, because the young people find it terribly upsetting when you do that. I understand that you worked in education.
And, Tony Blair, as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, announced his 3 priorities for United Kingdom, for Great Britain. And you know these 3 priorities? Education, education, education. So I got a question at the press conference in Brussels, what I say to such priorities as Education Commissioner. I said, great, when I was younger we got the same in each part of our schools. Uczyć, uczyć, uczyć. From Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, tak. So the same message from Lenin and from Tony Blair. Uczyć, uczyć, uczyć. My answer was, yes, this is important. But the difference is, what do you study and from whom? From Marx, Utopia, or from wise people of our history? So my answer to this educational initiative there, congratulations, madam, is learn from history, because this is true teacher, real teacher, facts. Historia magistra vitae est. No comment. Then don't put quality against quantity, or how to say, equity against equality, that either is horizontal system or vertical. You have Premier League, but then very low education levels. Equity and equality, the two must be a double objective for Poland, for Slovakia, for all. Then you will see better results, not either, both. And the last is lifelong learning. Without lifelong learning, there is no lifelong earning today. On America, the best answer whether globalization is more important or localization, local. We live local in global world. So the answer, correct answer, the best answer is subsidiarity. We are learning in the Union to organize our life under the principle of subsidiarity. It is not replacement of freedom, it is a second name for freedom. And it is not against or replacement of solidarity, but it should follow all other means as important, but subsidiarity comes first, and then solidarity if the local level is not capable to deal with, major problems or bigger issues. And the last on new generation. If we pray Pater Noster, it means we are all equal, brothers and sisters. So my son, in terms of eternity, is my brother. I am not above him. I am invited to serve because I was served, and I am served still. So we need each other. Everybody needs somebody. And my answer, not only because I am father and husband, is that, and I like that Herman van Rompuy said at the end, we should be people of hope. If we are Christians, it must be visible that we have hope. If we don't have hope, it's empty. Let's wake up. So be deeply human means being man or woman of hope. And the last, what I wanted to share here, dignity. Dignity is growing in a culture on two legs. Which one is more important, left or right? Both. For moving to the other, to my brother, to my sister, to my neighbor, even to my enemy. Christianity differs from others saying, love your enemy. It doesn't mean to agree. It doesn't mean to comply or to do nothing, but to look for the ways how to stop division in the UK, hostile division of United Kingdom, in the United Kingdom, hostile division in our countries, hostility. So culture of human dignity is built on one leg, which says, don't do the others what you don't want others to do unto you. It's reciprocity. Very clear, very simple. Tolerance. The other one says, do unto others what you want others to do unto you. And what is the most human expression or gift? Human love. Let's don't forget it. Thank you.
Widzę jeszcze 4 pytania, czy 5 nawet.
Seems there are 4 or 5 hands in the air. Let us have maybe 3 questions, and maybe later towards the end 2 questions. It seems there are a number of people waiting here to take the floor. Yes, please. I'm Igor Shaban. Good afternoon. Kiev, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. First of all, I wish to thank you for addressing your invitation to meet your conference. We are sitting here together, speaking and listening about Europe. It seems we speak mainly about the European Union and not so much about Europe in a geographic sense. But thank you very much for inviting also guests from Ukraine. This is very precious for us too. You speak about new policies, about also changes to the security defense in Europe. You'd need to perhaps conclude that it was lacking, it was missing, and now a new policy is being shaped. And I have here a certain question. This policy, security policy for European countries, is very much related to the Russian aggression. How do you think, if this Russian aggression continues for 10 years, for instance, what impact is it going to have on the position of Europe and action in the security policy of Europe? And the second question, what is the role of Ukraine? Can you see any role for Ukraine in that? This aggression, let us remember, it's been continuing for 10 years. Yes, so another years, I meant, another 10 years, yeah. And yes, straight away, and we've got 2 more questions, the same row. Krzysztof Trembacz, Ignatian University. Reference also to what the previous speaker said. Europe, its security, and the potential, perhaps, paths for the new construct of the European security. Do they need to be linked to NATO? Because we know that in November this year we're going to have a new election in the United States and a possible change in the administration of the US. This is my second question. Can this change perhaps have an impact and change the way the European Union sees security in the context of NATO? And perhaps a change might be needed coming back to the ideas from 1950s and a certain, perhaps, European security community. Thank you. And the next one, your neighbor, and then time to respond. Straight away, should I ask the next question straight away? Yes. Kacper Kieciński, the Episcopal University, John Paul II here in Krakow. I actually wanted to ask roughly about the same thing. Educating for values. They remember the year 2004 and the special emotions we all shared when Poland was becoming part of the European Union. I do not quite remember. I was 4 actually at that time. But I remember the Poland we lived in 2008, 2010, and the people who were born at that time, those born, say, in 2010, they don't even remember the Poland we lived in before the first European funds actually reached us. What they live in, the world they live in, is something that was given to them. They didn't have to strive for that. So how can we convince them to those values, deepest values? Because again, I remember from my school, we were taught at school about European institutions, the name of the president of the EU, but it's not perhaps the most important thing. What should be the strategy to inform perhaps young people and education? I'm also wondering what kind of EU education you have in Slovakia. That would be interesting to compare. Thank you very much. 3 questions on security, mainly. What if the war continues for a long time, and is it going to bring about perhaps more responsibility for security on the part of the Europeans? And the second about this education for values. Security first. Madam Bieńkowska. Yes, it's right. Before 2012, 2013, there was no common security policy in the EU. Mr. Commissioner mentioned 1954. From my personal experience, actually, I remember Great Britain for years was blocking common security policy in Europe. Still at that time, I remember 2013 or 2014, the war already was starting, as you know, at that time in Eastern Europe. But when we were thinking about this sector, we focused more on the economic side of this challenge. We are losing billions now. Well, in the face of war, maybe it's a mercantile approach, too much focused on finances, but Europe as a whole is losing billions of euros every year because different countries produce the same roughly in this sector or have similar tenders. Now, it's a huge, certainly, step forward. We keep hearing security, defense sector all the time. We are going to have a new commissioner responsible for defense. The president of the commission speaks about the defense sector that is basically on an equal footing to, for instance, economic challenges or the deal. More and more often we hear the clean deal, not so much the green deal. But certainly this subject is going to stay with us. But well, still, I think that cooperation in the defense sector and security sector, both making purchases and procurement, certainly this cooperation is going to be there. It's going to develop for years. But this certainly is not, well, absolutely not. It's not an alternative to NATO. I want to make it very clear. NATO is NATO. We are not looking for an alternative to NATO. NATO guarantees our security. Most of the, I'm not sure, 23, I think, member states are at the same time members of NATO. And again, let me stress that we are going to work together, not as an alternative to NATO, but simply as an option to solve problems together, because there are completely new challenges now. Cyber security, also security in space. This is where Europe and NATO, from the point of view of security, this is where we have to act. But certainly EU defense policy is not going to replace NATO, at least in our lifetime. Thank you very much. As for the European defense security, we have kept talking on this for years. We, meaning Poland, the year 2022 for many Western European countries, it was a cold shower. and the surprise that there is a need to focus on this area. It was nothing new for us. Let me stress that from the beginning, once the current government, Donald Tusk, his government has assumed power in Poland, the issue of security and defense is very high at the top of the agenda. Also, it's high on the European agenda, as you know. The recent conclusions of the European Council, for the first time, actually, the security policy was listed as one of the priorities of the EU, and actually asking the European Commission and asking the High Commissioner to find sources of financing for defense, European common defense. This was clearly formulated there. So it is time, I think now we've all come to realize, to focus on our common defense. This is one of the pillars of our security, which has, of course, a number of different dimensions. We mentioned it before. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be a fast process. We all know that the whole EU machinery needs to take action. It's not easy, but we need to be able, first of all, to take responsibility for our security. Again, not as an alternative, again, to NATO, the United States, but we just have to understand that we have to make sure that we have some safeguards. We can take action, or should be able to take action, we as the EU, because, well, the situation might change for the worse in the future. Also, our defense sector. We used to be in a poor shape, but now certainly we want to strengthen that sector, and again, not as an alternative NATO. I think Ireland and Austria are not part of NATO. After Sweden and Finland joined NATO, you can basically say that almost all EU states are part of NATO. It's in the interest of NATO now to strengthen the defense potential of all member states of NATO. So this is, I think, quite clear now. And as for the following question, those attempts to educate the new generations, stressing values. I understand you speak about the values that are at the very foundation of the EU: freedom, solidarity, democracy, human rights, the rule of law. I would say that those values are important for citizens. I must say, well, honestly, that there is no clear connection to, for instance, what we had in 1998 or then 2008 or 2004. Speaking about the emotions at that time, I said that simply we Poles wanted to become part of this better world based on those values. We still remembered very well the world before, a decade or 2 decades before. I think that what is especially important for the education of all of us as citizens was the recent 8 years, the 8 years where we have seen what the Constitutional Tribunal in Poland is, what the Supreme Court is, and the 8 years of our recent history. This has resulted in the high turnout at the parliamentary elections, unprecedented turnout, actually, other European countries expressing their satisfaction, and they were also very much impressed by this high turnout at Polish parliamentary elections last year. Populism does not have to win in Europe. It can be stopped by the activity of citizens, by free media. So this shows actually that we have a significant potential. We just have to focus on educating, yes, our young generations in the values so important for citizens. At the same time, our approach certainly is needed here. So I think that those 8 years was very important for all of us.
2 very brief questions, because we need to wrap up soon. Like 2 brief, really brief questions. One gentleman and another one who had raised his hand earlier. Apologies, we really need to wrap up. We have a Holy Mass at 6. It's a question. Przemysław Walicki, good afternoon. My question pertains mostly to security. The development of security industry, mostly here in Poland. That's what I would like to address. Do you think that in the most threatened countries you could set up a special economic zone that would make it possible better to help this defense industry? There are these military first in Kielce was there. I took to the industry. So that was the first question. A very brief question. Yes, it's been included in the Commission's plans. University Jagielloński. Transformations, major transformations in the EU have been discussed. How can you convince consumers that so far we haven't been very active? How can we play a more active role so that we can achieve this necessary and major transformation? I'm not sure we understood the question. Please ask the question again. Be slower and speak more. Do not read. Do not read. I meant it to simplify things. So there are the transformation costs that have been mentioned. Somebody will have to take these costs, incur them. So the society will have to be mobilized. Is there a way to convince society to support this transformation, to make it happen? You say transformation, you mean the green transformation? What kind of transformation? The transformation that you talked about when you spoke about the changes in the EU, that the EU needs a new path, a new direction. That would require more time to respond. There are no reforms that would be costless. It is something that needs to be reiterated. Every reform incurs a cost. Thank you to the panelists. May I ask for a round of applause? We need to wrap up because the organizers are letting me know when we need to finish. May I give the floor to Rafał? Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you to the moderator.